Yeah, I forgot to do this. Got it? Thank you. Yeah, I forgot to do this when we did the Passover or the unleavened bread teaching. I forgot to hit record until well into it, so I kind of lost that teaching, which was a bummer. So we're making sure not to do that this time. But I wanted to talk about the idea of sacrifice, and I thought about doing like a kind of an all-encompassing teaching just about sacrifice in general. And as I got into this study, I realized that that's way too much for just a one-shot thing. That's a multi-part series, and I don't have a multi-part series in me right now. So this came up because a few weeks ago I did a teaching on Passover, just kind of the nuts and bolts basic of how do we keep Passover today. And not really getting into the spiritual aspect of it, but just like, you decide you want to start keeping Yahweh's holy days. Passover's one of those. What do you do? And one of the things that we went through was the idea of the sacrificing of the lamb. And I made the point there that my position on keeping the commandments is, once you endeavor to actually intentionally keep the Father's commandments, you have a question of, first off, can I keep the commandment? If the answer is yes, then you should. If the answer is no, then you ask yourself, okay, why can't I keep the commandment? If the answer is because of my circumstances, which it will inevitably be, then you have the next question, can I change my circumstances or not? If you can change your circumstances, then I believe that you should, and then that would enable you to keep the commandment. If you cannot change your circumstances, it's beyond your control, and you can't keep the commandment. And our Father is a righteous judge, and He knows our circumstances. He's not going to hold people accountable for not doing something if it's impossible for them. So bringing that into the idea of Passover, the question was, can we do Passover the way it's written in the Scriptures today in 2024 America? And I made the position that, generally speaking, yes. With enough preparation, even with the actual sacrifice of the lamb, with enough preparation, in most cases, people can do that even today, just practical. Not talking spiritual, should we, but can we? I think in most cases, yes. And that's on YouTube, if anybody wants to see that hasn't seen it, on the Three Measures Ministry page there. But the question came up in response to that, well, what do we do about Leviticus 17? And Leviticus 17 talks about specifically that when you kill animals with the intention of eating them, they have to be brought into the tabernacle or the temple. And so obviously Passover is a sacrifice that you eat. So how does that fit? So looking into that, I thought it would be good to get into just a general overview of sacrificial history, people offering sacrifices, the circumstances, starting all the way back in Genesis, going up into New Testament times, and kind of taking a look at kind of like what is the point of a sacrifice, because the purpose of a sacrifice has a lot to do with where you're able to do the sacrifice. That'll make sense as we go through. So we're going to read through a bunch of scriptures here, and this is one of those cases where I want to clarify before I even get started. Whenever you teach, the obvious goal is to convince, because if you're teaching something, you believe it to be true. And the point of teaching other people is you want them to believe the same thing. So as someone that endeavors to teach the word of Yahweh, that's obviously my point, just point blank. I'm trying to convince you of whatever I believe. Otherwise, why would I be doing it? This is one of those things where I'm not trying to convince you one way or another, should you do a Passover sacrifice or should you not. I'm gearing this more towards putting the information out there so you can make an informed decision on if you choose to do this with your family or not, or so you can at least understand for people that choose to do this why they're doing it. So there's no convincing in this. That's not my goal this time. This is just strictly informative. So Genesis 4, we'll start off with the very first mention. And to keep it simple, I thought about going through the different types of sacrifices and getting into like the different Hebrew words like olah and korban and things like that, and kind of differentiating. But I'm just going to keep it simple, and I'm just going to look generally at in our English where we see words like sacrifice and offering and the different tenses, past and present and future. So Genesis 4, we're going to read verses 1 through 5. Genesis 4, 1 through 5. Let me get my Bible up here where I can actually see it better. Okay. Now the man, this is Adam, had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I've gotten a man-child with the help of Yahweh. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel, And Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to Yahweh of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. So this is the first record of someone giving an offering in the Scriptures. And I already mentioned that I wasn't going to get into like definitions of word, but this one's interesting because when you look at the word for offering here in the Greek, it's the word minha. And this is, when we look at the grain offering later in Leviticus, that's a specific type of offering called a minha. But it's also when we look at Jacob and Esau. When Esau is coming, and then Jacob sends his messengers out to Esau with a present. He's sending all these, gifts and things out to Esau to kind of try to smooth things over with him so he doesn't massacre his family. That word for present in our English is this same word for offering here in Genesis. So there's a type of offering that is considered what we would call a gift or a present. So we already have this idea that not all offerings are the same. Nobody's going to look at the offering here that Cain and Abel did and say that has to do with sin or atonement or anything like that. It's strictly you're giving something to Yahweh like we would giving a present to someone. It's that same kind of idea. And we're just going to go through this. And, of course, we see this over in Hebrews 11, 1 through 4, talking about this. This same thing. We'll read this real quick here. Hebrews 11, 1 through 4. This is the famous Hall of Faith. I don't know if I can get to it. Hebrews 11, 1 through 4. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the men of old gained approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of Elohim, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. By faith Abel offered to Elohim a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, Elohim testifying about his gifts, there's that word, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. So we don't have a lot of information about Abel in the Bible, but we know that whatever this gift was that he gave to Yahweh, we know it was from the flock, it was pleasing to Yahweh, and Yahweh accepted Abel. And so this is kind of, to me, I think in terms of like the law of first mention, and people usually use that with specific words. Generally, if you're looking at like a Hebrew or a Greek word, the very first time you see that mentioned in the Scriptures sets the tone for how you interpret that word going forward. And I think a lot of times we can apply that same thing to concepts. So a concept like sacrifice, the first time we look at it in the Scriptures can help us to set the tone for what that means going forward. It's not waterproof, it's not bulletproof, but generally speaking, I think it works. So let's go back to Genesis. We're going to go to Genesis 8 this time. And as we get through this, you're going to see a donut hole in what we're going to read. We're going to read a bunch of scriptures. There's going to be a big gap of scriptures that we're not going to read, and there's a reason for that I'll make clear as we go. So Genesis 8, if I can get there, 15, we're going to read 15 through 21. Genesis 8, 15 through 21. This is after the flood. Elohim spoke to Noah, saying, we just sang a song about this, didn't we? Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Yahweh smelled the soothing aroma, and Yahweh said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So Noah comes out of the ark, and he makes a burnt offering on this altar. This is in Hebrew the word zebach. And we see this is going to be, we see this word in Leviticus chapter 1 where it's talking about the burnt offerings. And we're going to see this. If we were to get into the Hebrew, we would see this a lot. Generally speaking, in our English, it'll say burnt offering. You might see occasionally something like elevation offering or heave offering, but generally it's burnt offering. So let's go to Genesis 22. So far we've got Abel offering some kind of sacrifice. It doesn't say he sacrificed it. It said he offered it. It does say specifically with Noah that he burnt his up on an altar. So Genesis 22, I went right past it. And this is the famous offering of Isaac. Now, this is interesting because with Abraham, there's numerous instances of him building an altar. But when you read those instances, it doesn't say he did anything with the altar. It's more of the idea of building an altar of like witness, like we would think of it in modern terms of building a monument or building a memorial that's supposed to remind us of something. So it's kind of implied that that's sort of Abraham's intentions when he built those altars. He would build an altar and then he would call upon the name of Yahweh. And when he does that, he's basically submitting himself to Yahweh's authority. We mentioned earlier that Yahweh's name encompasses his reputation, his authority, all of those things. So let's read, this is the offering of Isaac. We'll read the whole chapter, I think, here. Maybe not the whole chapter. Now it came about after these things that Elohim tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham? And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which Elohim had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. So Abraham is talking about going and worshiping. Now, we know he's going to make an offering, but it's this idea that making an offering, making a sacrifice, is part of worship, at least in Abraham's mind at this time. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, Elohim will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which Elohim had told him. Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the boy and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear Elohim, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place that Yahweh will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of Yahweh it will be provided. So we'll just go ahead and stop there. But this is interesting because I mentioned earlier, Abraham has a history by this point of building altars, but it doesn't say he did anything with them as far as sacrifice. We know he's going to offer Isaac here. And when we read between the lines in this text, it's clear that Abraham knows how to offer a burnt offering. He knows the procedure. He knows how to go about it, which implies that he's done it before. So even though it doesn't say he offered sacrifices on those altars he built, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but at some point in his life, he was doing some kind of burnt offering, so he knew the procedure, and the people around him are talking like this is normal stuff. This is just kind of what they do. Nobody was, freaking out or, nobody was questioning this whole thing. It's just a kind of a normal thing. We're going to go and offer a sacrifice. We're going to go and worship. So that's Abraham, the father of our faith. Let's go to Genesis 31 now. Genesis 31, we're going to start reading in verse 43. Now, this is Jacob and Laban. This is when Jacob is making his covenant with Laban after all his issues with his father-in-law. Then Laban replied to Jacob, The daughters of my daughters and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters or to their children whom they have borne? So now come, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. So they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Now Laban called it Jegar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me this day. Therefore it was named Galeed. And Mizpah, for he said, may Yahweh watch between me and you when we are absent from one another. So this is what I mentioned earlier about this idea of putting stones up, like an altar or like a pillar or a heap, this idea that the stones are a witness. Now, obviously, stones don't have intelligence. They don't literally witness things, at least not that we know of, but it's what it represents. Verse 50, if you mistreat my daughters or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no man is with us, see Elohim as witness between you and me. Laban said to Jacob, behold the heap and behold the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass by this heap to you for harm, and you will not pass by this heap and this pillar to me for harm. The Elohim of Abraham and the Elohim of Nahor, the Elohim of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his kinsmen to the meal, and they ate the meal and spent the night on the mountain. Early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. So we have this idea here that they're making a covenant, and as part of this covenant, Jacob is offering sacrifices. Now, we see this type of sacrifice, Passover is one of these types of sacrifices where you're not just burning up all of the animal. I mean, there's a specific type of sacrifice, a whole burnt offering. The whole animal gets burnt. You don't get any of it. There are certain types of animal sacrifice where you could think of it in modern terms as like a cookout or a barbecue. The intention is to eat it. And some of it gets burned up to Yahweh, but some of it gets eaten by the people offering the sacrifice. So this is the idea here. They're offering a sacrifice, but they're also partaking in that sacrifice. They're eating some of it as part of their covenant meal here. So these are all examples of people offering sacrifices, and this is where because we're talking about location. We're talking about where and when. These are examples of people offering sacrifices prior to Mount Sinai, prior to the temple, prior to the tabernacle, prior to the Levites, and they're doing it outside of Jerusalem. So just to kind of establish some context here. So let's go to Genesis 46. We're just going to read one verse there. If you feel like turning for one verse, you're welcome to, but I'll just read it. So Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba, and he offered sacrifices to the Elohim of his father Isaac. Now this is when Jacob has moved down to Egypt. So he gets to Egypt, and one of the first things he does here on his way down is he offers a sacrifice. So it's another indication of the patriarchs offering sacrifices. It doesn't say what kind of sacrifice. It doesn't say if it was a whole burnt offering or a burnt offering, but he was doing something that we would consider a sacrifice. So now we're going to get into Exodus. We're just moving through the Torah here. Exodus 5, we're going to read verses 1 through 9. A lot of scripture today. And I want to leave plenty of time after this for questions and answers and strong opinions, or questions and comments. Hopefully answers. Exodus 5, 1 through 9. Afterward, now this is when the beginning of Moses interacting with Pharaoh to get the Hebrews out of Egypt. Afterward, Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is Yahweh that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and besides, I will not let Israel go. So in other words, Pharaoh has this list of gods that he knows from the Egyptian pantheon, and he's probably heard of other gods from the nations around him interacting with those nations. And here's this God that he's never heard of. So this is not like like Yahweh as a name has zero relevance. It has zero clout to Pharaoh. Verse 3, then they said, the Elohim of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our Elohim. Otherwise he will fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Get back to your labors. Again, Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land now are many, and you would have them cease from their labors? So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people and their foremen, saying, "You are no longer to give the people straw to make bricks, as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves." How far was I going to go here? I was going to go to verse 9, okay. "But the quota of the bricks which they were making previously you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any of it. Because they're lazy, therefore they cry out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our Elohim.' Let the labor be heavier on the men, and let them work at it so that they will pay no attention to these false words." So we've got this idea that the Hebrews are going to go out 3 days' journey into the wilderness to make offerings to Yahweh, sacrifices to Yahweh, and this is in conjunction with keeping some kind of a feast to Yahweh. And we won't read through it here, but they're having this conversation back and forth with Pharaoh about they're kind of negotiating what they can take with them. And, of course, they want to take everything with them, and Pharaoh says, "No, you can't take everything, but you can take this." And they're like, no, we get all or nothing. And so the idea is they need to take livestock with them because Pharaoh wants to keep the livestock. But they say we need to take the livestock with us because we need something to offer to our Elohim. So they're clearly wanting to go out into and Yahweh told them this, they're clearly wanting to go out into the wilderness to do offerings, to do sacrifices to Yahweh. Let's go to Exodus 12. Of course, this is dealing directly with Passover. We're going to read verses 1 through 28. Exodus 12. "Now Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, 'This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to,'" and this is important for what we're setting up here, "'Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of the month they are to each one take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's household, a lamb for each household. Now if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them. According to what each man should eat, you are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation is to kill it at twilight.'" So this is kind of a question of who can make an offering. All the congregation of Israel is to kill the Passover at twilight. There's no mention of specific people being delegated to the task. And he just told us that we're to take a lamb for each household. So we have this idea that each household is going to kill their own lamb. And we're going to see that kind of fleshed out as we go here. Verse 7, "Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel and on the houses of which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs along with its entrails. You shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover." So and this is kind of a concept that we see, and I don't want to focus too much on Passover specifically, but we see this connection between the word Pesach, Passover, and the actual lamb itself. We see language in the scriptures that talk about preparing the Passover or slaying the Passover. So you're not literally killing the day of Passover. You're not slaying the ritual of Passover. You're slaying the lamb. So there's an equal sign, apples to apples, between Pesach and the actual lamb. They become interchangeable. So verse 12, "For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh." Hallelujah, he is Yahweh. "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance." And this is going to come into play with some of the time references here, because we're talking about where and when do sacrifices take place, then and now. So basically, those of us who have endeavored to keep the Father's commandments, we see these words like permanent throughout your generations, and we're really comfortable applying to that with things like Sabbath, the holy days, eating clean, but then there's certain issues where we don't apply it. And so I've had conversations with people about this recently, and specifically in regards to actually killing a lamb, because if you're going to eat lamb, somebody's killing that lamb. It's either somebody at the butcher shop or somebody in a foreign country where they raised it, New Zealand, Australia, or whatever. Somebody is killing that lamb before it ends up on your table. And in my position, if you're going to actually eat lamb, it makes sense if you're able to just do it yourself, because that way you can make sure that it's an appropriate lamb. It's a male, a year old, without blemish. You get it from the grocery store, you have no clue what you're getting into. Again, this is opinion. This is not trying to convince. Where were we here? Where was I? Oh, yeah. Verse 15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Moses called for the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and take for yourselves lambs according to the families and slay the Passover. Now, my English here has lamb in italics, which means that it's not there in the Hebrew. So in the Hebrew, he's literally saying slay the Passover, like we just mentioned. Passover equals lamb. And he's telling the elders of Israel to do this. So at this point, we don't have a Levitical priesthood. We don't have a tabernacle. This is in the hands of the elders to go and slay the Passover. So we've got this pattern that's developing of non-Levites offering sacrifices outside of the land of Israel, outside of the tabernacle system, okay? And let's see here. Where was I? Verse 22. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and dip it in the blood, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the two doorposts, and none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come to your house to smite you. You shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which Yahweh will give you, as he promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, What does this rite mean? You shall say, It is a Passover sacrifice. It is a sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the house of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but he spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshipped. And so it's really clear that something like Passover is a sacrifice. So if we're endeavoring to keep Passover, that's why this idea of sacrifice is so important, because navigating, because we've done almost 2,000 years of Christianity at this point, and all the stuff it's done to biblical doctrine and understanding. And so this is one of those things, if we're going to understand how to keep the commandments, this is a key component, because we do see things like Passover. There are sacrificial components to most of Yahweh's holy days. And I've actually seen people make the argument, like say with tabernacles. Well, we can't keep tabernacles because we can't do all the stuff. So like we can't do all the sacrifices. With tabernacles, you had a certain amount of bulls you had to sacrifice every day, and we can't do all of that stuff and this, that, and the other. So because we can't do that, we shouldn't do any of it. So there are people who take an all-or-nothing approach with the holy days, and I think it's important to kind of define what we can and cannot do. Like I said earlier, the things that we can do, we should do. And with most of these, there's a component that's for the priesthood, and there's a component that's for the laity. And for those of us that are not in the priesthood, just because the priests aren't able to do their function doesn't mean that we can't do ours. So let's go to Exodus 20. This is the Ten Commandment chapter, but we're going to read a section of the chapter that normally doesn't get included when people talk about the Ten Commandments. So he's just given the Ten Commandments. He's spoken to the people verbally. They've heard the voice of Yahweh here. and they've asked Moses to intercede. Like, you go talk to them. This is too scary for us. We can't handle it. And so now we're going to be in verse, we're going to start reading in verse 22. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven." And this is important. "You shall not make other gods besides me. Gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves." Okay, so that's clear. That's a negative command. Don't do this. Okay? Now we have a positive command. "You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. And every place I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it out of cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it." So he's setting up a juxtaposition here. He's basically saying, I don't want you to worship me with idols of gold and silver like everybody else worships their God. I want you to worship me by making offerings on natural altars, either just plain dirt piles or uncut stone. Because, in that, we're using his creation to worship him as opposed to worshiping creation. Because with idols, that's part of creation. It's raw material, and, he created the raw material, we created the form, and that's what we're worshiping. But by doing, sacrifices with natural altars, everything is centered around our Creator. Everything points back to him. We didn't have anything to do with what's going on there. So it's a positive command. And this place, this key verse here, "Every place where I will cause my name to be remembered, I will come and bless you." We're going to look at that as we go through this later, this idea of where he places his name, because that has everything to do with where and when an Israelite follower of Yahweh then or now can offer a sacrifice. So let's go to, I said we have a lot of scriptures. Let's go to Joshua now. We're just kind of going through steadily. You'll notice we're skipping Leviticus. There's a reason for that. I mentioned earlier that I want to focus on sacrifices that took place outside of the Levitical system, outside of the tabernacle, the temple, outside of Jerusalem. And there's a reason for that, because for it to be relevant for us today, where we have none of those things in place, if we just strictly focus on the Levitical system, well, that's not relevant for us today. We don't have that in place. So I'm looking at all the stuff around the Levitical system to see if that applies to us today, yes or no. So Joshua 8, we're going to start reading in verse 30. We're going to go 30 through 35. Joshua 8, 30 through 35. If I can ever get there. Got to get past Deuteronomy. Joshua 8, 30 through 35. This is really interesting. So what has happened here is they've gone in and they made this agreement because Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan. And there was concern that as Israel went across the Jordan to conquer the land, they would just stay out and not help in the battle. So they made an agreement. We will go across the Jordan into battle with you and help you conquer the land that you're going to live in, and then we will come back over to the land that we're claiming. So we're at that point now where that's happened. Verse 30, where was it here? Then Joshua built an altar. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's in Joshua 22. This is before that. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, yeah, so this is after they crossed the Jordan, but they haven't conquered the land yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. So Joshua built an altar to Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, in Mount Ebal. Okay, not Jerusalem. Just as Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had commanded the sons of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded an iron tool, and they offered burnt offerings on it to Yahweh and sacrificed peace offerings. He wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. All Israel, with their elders and officers and their judges, were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had given command at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterward, he read all the words of the law and the blessing and the curse according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. So here Joshua builds a sacrifice. He does exactly what we read in Exodus 20, and he's offering burnt offerings there. And now, obviously, this is not in Jerusalem because they haven't conquered Jerusalem yet. But they do have a tabernacle, and they do have a functioning Levitical priesthood. So, in spite of that, he builds this separate altar and offers burnt offerings on it. Now, it says Joshua offered the burnt offerings. This is a little bit tricky because we see later where Solomon builds the temple. It specifically says Solomon builds the temple. I guarantee Solomon wasn't out there with hammers and chisels and pulleys and stuff building the temple. He had it done by him for other, he had 30,000 slaves do it. So, you could read the text as Joshua was offering the sacrifices, or you could read the text as Joshua had the sacrifices offered because he was the one in authority. But either way, it's outside of the Levitical system. Even though there were Levites there, it's not being done in the tabernacle. Now let's go to Joshua 22. This is where I was getting ahead of myself earlier. Joshua 22. This is after the conquest when the Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh had come back across the river. We're going to read the whole chapter. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of Yahweh, commanded you and have listened to my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days to this day. You have kept the charge of the commandment of Yahweh your Elohim. And now Yahweh your Elohim has given rest to your brothers as he spoke to them. Therefore turn now and go to your tents to the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of Yahweh, gave you beyond the Jordan, on the east side of Jordan. Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of Yahweh, commanded you, to love Yahweh your Elohim and walk in all his ways and keep his commandments and hold fast to him and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." He's kind of combining Deuteronomy 6 there with Leviticus 19. So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they all went to their tents. Now to the one half-tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan, and to the other half Joshua gave a possession among their brothers westward beyond the Jordan. So when Joshua sent them away to their tents, he blessed them and said to them, "Return to your tents with great riches and with very much livestock, with silver, gold, bronze, iron, and with very many clothes. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers." The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh returned home and departed from the sons of Israel at Shiloh. This is where all this is taking place, Joshua talking to them, which is in the land of Canaan, to go to the land of Gilead, to the land of their possession, which they had possessed according to the command of Yahweh through Moses. Now, Shiloh is important because Shiloh is a city up in the northern country where they first established, this is where they rested the tabernacle for a long time. This is where they set up. This is where it says specifically Yahweh placed his name. It talks about later him removing his name from Shiloh because the priesthood under Eli had become corrupted, and it was just a sham. So the first center of centralized worship, once they got into the land, was in Shiloh in the north. Later on, of course, it becomes Jerusalem. But this is important. Verse 10, when they came to the region of the Jordan, which is in the land of Canaan, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by the Jordan, a large altar in appearance. So they just had this talk with Joshua in Shiloh, where the center of worship is going to be established, and the first thing they do when they get back across the river is build an altar. And by Zondervan New American Standard, the heading for this section is the offensive altar. Let's read why. Verse 11, the sons of Israel heard it and said, "Behold, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built an altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan in the region of Jordan on the side belonging to the sons of Israel." When the sons of Israel heard of it, the whole congregation of the sons of Israel gathered themselves at Shiloh to go up against them in war. And it's funny because just anecdotally, in modern times, from my own experience, the minute you talk about altars and sacrifice, it's almost like people are gathering together at war. It's like, oh, he's building an altar. He's going to go get him. And I think a lot of that is just because, and I wasn't going to get into this too much, but we know in the New Testament, it says very plainly that, Yahshua the Messiah is basically the ultimate sacrifice. Like there's nothing, you can't get a better sacrifice than the sinless Son of Yahweh. And so we know the atoning blood, we know the value of that sacrifice. So there's a tendency to when we start talking about sacrifices in modern times, there's a tendency to go right into, oh, you're you're coming out from under Messiah. You're negating his sacrifice. It's not valuable to you. Otherwise, why would you be doing this other stuff? But in my opinion, you can have both if it's done properly, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about here. And this altar here is a prime example of this. So, so verse 13, the sons of Israel sent to the sons of Reuben and to the sons of Gad and to the half-tribe of Manasseh into the land of Gilead, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and with him 10 chiefs, one chief for each father's household from each of the tribes of Judah, of Israel. And each one of them was the head of his father's household among the thousands of Israel. So these are all the men that have authority positions within the camp of Israel. Okay, this is basically, these are the elders of Israel. These guys have clout. And these are the people that are being sent over to handle this. Verse 15, they came to the sons of Reuben and to the sons of Gad and to the half-tribe of Manasseh to the land of Gilead, and they spoke with them, saying, thus says the whole congregation of Yahweh, what is this unfaithful act which you have committed against the Elohim of Israel, turning away from following Yahweh this day by building yourselves an altar to rebel against Yahweh this day? And like I mentioned, their first thought was they're assuming the reason you're building this altar is because you're rebelling from Yahweh. And like I mentioned earlier, in modern times, we could say the reason you're building this altar is because you're denying Messiah. These types of things. That's the assumption. But let's find out why they're really doing this. Verse 17, is not the iniquity of Peor enough for us? So speaking of the Baal Peor incident, for which we have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came on the congregation of Yahweh, that you must turn away this day from following Yahweh. So they're thinking you're turning away from following Yahweh. If you rebel against Yahweh today, he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel tomorrow. If, however, the land of your possession is unclean, then cross into the land of the possession of Yahweh, where Yahweh's tabernacle stands, and take possession among us. Only do not rebel against Yahweh or rebel against us by building an altar for yourselves besides the altar of Yahweh or Elohim. So there's an altar of Elohim there at the tabernacle in Shiloh. And so they're basically saying, look, if there's a legitimate reason why you feel like you need to do this, you don't have to do this over here. Come over with us. It's cool. You know, we can make it work. But we're going to find out that they have different motivations here. Verse 20, did not Achan, the son of Zerah, act unfaithfully in the things under the ban? This is talking about when the battle of Ai. And wrath fell upon all the congregation of Israel, and that man did not perish alone in his iniquity. So they're afraid that Yahweh is going to judge these people on the east side of the Jordan and the people on the west side of the Jordan. They're afraid that they're going to be taken down with them. So they kind of have their own vested interest in this. Then the sons of, verse 21, then the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh answered and spoke to the heads of the families of Israel. Now, this is really, I'm convinced in the Hebrew that it makes more sense, but we're going to read in the English here that they're saying something and then they're saying the exact opposite. And in our English way of thinking, they can't both be true. But I'm wondering if in the Hebrew there's more subtle nuance where it kind of does make more sense. But either way, we're going to kind of read between the lines of what they're talking about here. Verse 22, the mighty one, Elohim, Yahweh, the mighty one, Elohim, Yahweh, he knows, and may Israel itself know. If it was in rebellion, or if it is an unfaithful act against Yahweh, do not save us this day. If we have built us an altar to turn away from following Yahweh, or if to offer a burnt offering or grain offering on it, or if to offer sacrifices of peace offerings on it, may Yahweh himself require it. But surely we have done this out of concern, for a reason, saying, in time to come your sons may say to our sons, what have you to do with Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel? Because there's a natural geographic barrier. The Jordan, you can't just walk across the Jordan when you feel like it. It's an endeavor. You've got to find a crossing point or find a low spot where you've got less rain, more of a drought. Maybe use a ferry. It's not just an easy thing to do. Verse 25, for Yahweh has made the Jordan a border between us and you sons of Reuben and sons of Gad. You have no portion in Yahweh. So your sons may make our sons stop fearing Yahweh. And by fearing Yahweh, they functionally kind of mean worshiping. And we see this same kind of idea develop later when Israel splits under King Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Because the centralized worship is in Jerusalem, where it's supposed to be at that time, under King Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Jeroboam goes up north, and he sets up 2 centers of worship in Dan and Bethel. That's where they actually build golden calves. And he moves the Feast of Tabernacles from the 7th month to the 8th month, and he says, you guys don't have to go down there to worship. It's too inconvenient. Just stay up here with me. And so this is kind of a mirror of that. Like, the people on the west side are looking at the people on the east side and thinking that this is their motive. Like, you guys are trying to intentionally move away from worshiping Yahweh and do things your own way here. Verse 26, therefore we said, let us build an altar, not for burnt offering or for sacrifice. Rather, it shall be a witness between us. And we mentioned this idea of altars as witnesses. Between us and you and between our generations after us, that we are to perform the service of Yahweh before him with our burnt offerings and with our sacrifices and with our peace offerings, so that your sons will not say to our sons in time to come, you have no portion in Yahweh. Therefore we said, it shall also come about, if they say this to us or to our generations in time to come, then we shall say, see, the copy of the altar of Yahweh which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings or for sacrifice, rather it is a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against Yahweh and turn away from following Yahweh this day by building an altar for burnt offering, for grain offering, or for sacrifice, besides the altar of Yahweh or Elohim, which is before his tabernacle. Now, they said a couple times here, we're not building this to do burnt offering and sacrifice. But if we go in and we see in verse 27, that's basically what they're saying they're going to do. They say that we may perform the service of Yahweh before him with our burnt offerings and with our sacrifices and with our peace offerings, so that your sons will not say to our sons in time to come, you have no portion in Yahweh. So they're simultaneously saying, we're not going to offer burnt offerings and things on this altar, but that's exactly what we're going to do. And so to me, the whole issue here is authority. Like, when they offer those sacrifices on that altar, are they doing it under Yahweh's authority? Are they showing, we're submitting to you, or are they doing it in rebellion? Because the knee-jerk reaction of the Israelites is, you guys are doing it in rebellion. And they're basically saying, no. We're doing this to link up with you guys. We're doing this so that we don't lose touch with what's going on, that we don't lose touch with the God of Israel. That's their intent, coming directly from them. So verse 30, is that right? Yeah, verse 30. So when Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the congregation, even the heads of the families of Israel who were with him, heard the words which the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the sons of Manasseh spoke, it pleased them. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, said to the sons of Reuben and to the sons of Gad and to the sons of Manasseh, today we know that Yahweh is in our midst, because you have not committed this unfaithful act against Yahweh. Now you have delivered the sons of Israel from the hand of Yahweh. Then Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and the leaders returned from the sons of Reuben and from the sons of Gad, from the land of Gilead to the land of Canaan, to the sons of Israel, and brought back word to them. The word pleased the sons of Israel, and the sons of Israel blessed Elohim. And they did not speak of going up against them in war to destroy the land in which the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad were living. The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad called the altar witness, for they said, it is a witness between us that Yahweh is Elohim. So their intent with this altar was to offer sacrifices, but not in a rebellious way. They weren't going to do what Jeroboam did and say, hey, we're going to branch off and do things our way. This is a mirror. They actually called it a copy. We're trying to mirror what you guys are doing on the other side. We're trying to sync up with you guys. Because if you think about it, if I live in Gilead, there's a type of offering called a Thanksgiving offering. It doesn't have anything to do with sin. If I want to offer that offering, I've got to cross the Jordan and take this trek all the way down to Shiloh or later Jerusalem. So it makes logical sense if my intent is to bring that to Yahweh and to no other God, why can't I do that on the side of the Jordan where I'm at? The intent is the same. The objective is the same. I'm still submitting to his authority. The only difference is the location. So let's go to 1 Samuel now. We're going to go to 1 Samuel, chapter 10. We're going to read verses 1 through 8. 1 Samuel 10, 1 through 8. And so far, nobody that's offered these sacrifices has been struck down by lightning. And that's a pattern we're going to see that holds. So 1 Samuel 10, verses 1 through 8. Then Samuel took the flask of oil, poured it on his head. This is getting into the anointing of Saul. Kissed him and said, "Has not Yahweh anointed you a ruler over his inheritance? When you go from me today, then you will find 2 men close to Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah. And they will say to you, 'The donkeys which you went to look for have been found. Now behold, your father has ceased to be concerned about the donkeys and is anxious for you, saying, What shall I do about my son?' Then you will go on further from there, and you will come as far as the oak of Tabor. And there 3 men going up to Elohim at Bethel will meet you, one carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a jug of wine. And they will greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from their hand. Afterward you will come to the hill of Elohim, where the Philistine garrison is. And it shall be as soon as you have come there to the city, that you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with harp, tambourine, flute, and a lyre before them, and they will be prophesying. Then the Spirit of Yahweh will come upon you mightily, and you shall prophesy with them and be changed into another man." So already here in the Old Testament, we have this idea of transformation, putting off the old man, becoming a new creation. It's not... Uh-oh. Computer's getting weird. Okay. Where was I here? That was verse... So verse 7. "It shall be when these signs come to you, do for yourself what the occasion requires, for Elohim is with you. And you shall go down there before me to Gilgal," that's important, "and behold, I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings. You will wait 7 days until I come to you and show you what you should do." So he's saying that go to Gilgal, which is not Shiloh, it's not where the tabernacle is. Go there and wait for me, and I, Samuel, am going to come there after 7 days and make burnt offerings and peace offerings. Now, Samuel, the best I can tell, was not a Levite. It says that his father was an Ephraimite. So some people will say he's an Ephraimite because he lived in the land of Ephraim, but maybe he was a Levite that just happened to be there. But usually if someone's a legit Levite, it says so. So I'm thinking in this case, Samuel may not have even been a Levite. So you've got a person who's not a Levite offering sacrifices away from the tabernacle, with a standing tabernacle and a functional Levitical priesthood. Now, granted, at this time, the priesthood was kind of corrupt, but either way, because his own sons were corrupt. So let's go to 1 Samuel 13. Let me scroll down here. Uh, 1 Samuel 13, we're going to read verses 7 through 14. This is where things start to get bad for Saul. Or is that the next one? Yeah, 1 Samuel 13, 7 through 14. Okay. Also, some of they're engaged in a war with the Philistines at this point. Also, some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. But as for Saul, he was still at Gilgal, where we mentioned earlier, and all the people followed him trembling. Now he waited 7 days. We just read he was supposed to do this, according to the appointed time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of Yahweh. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your Elohim, which he commanded you. For now Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him as a ruler over his people, because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you." So Saul, in his own way of thinking, was doing something good. He wanted to inquire of Yahweh to get favor, in this battle. But he disobeyed the command of Yahweh. So Samuel was a confirmed prophet of Yahweh at that point. He was a judge of Israel. The authority was in Samuel. So when Samuel comes to you and says, "Do this," it's as good as Yahweh himself coming to you. So disobeying Samuel was the same as disobeying Yahweh. And so this is why his kingdom was taken from him. But it's interesting because, like I just read earlier, it was okay for Samuel to offer this sacrifice at Gilgal, being a potential non-Levite and definitely outside the tabernacle, but it was not okay for Saul because Saul had not been given authority to do this. And this all comes down to authority, in my opinion. So now we're going to go to 2 Samuel 24, 2 Samuel 24. David is in some serious trouble here. Now, David was not a Levite either. He was from the tribe of Judah. So 2 Samuel 24, we're going to read 18 through 25. Oh, went right past it. Is that right? 2 Samuel. Oh, 2 Samuel 24. Oops, let's go there. Yeah, 2 Samuel 24, 18 through 25. So Gad came to David that day and said to him, "Go up, erect an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite," which is not the tabernacle. Now, this is Jerusalem, but it's not the tabernacle, which was standing at that point, and we did have functioning priests under David. David went up according to the word of Gad, just as Yahweh had commanded. Araunah looked down and saw the king and his servants crossing over toward him, and Araunah went out and bowed his face to the ground before the king. Then Araunah said, "Why is my master the king come to his servant?" And David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to Yahweh, that the plague may be held back from the people." Araunah said to David, "Let my master the king take and offer up what is good in this sight." So he's saying, you just make whatever offering you need to right here, talking to David, somebody from the tribe of Judah. And this is all just natural conversation. Nobody's shocked by that. Offer up what is good in this sight. Look, the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. So he's going to offer up his own oxen and his own wooden implements as fuel for the fire. He's like I'm just going to do this. Let's just get this going here. "Everything, O king," Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, "May Yahweh your Elohim accept you." However, the king said to Araunah, "No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to Yahweh my Elohim, which cost me nothing. Otherwise, why would it be a sacrifice?" So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. David built there an altar to Yahweh and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Now, thus Yahweh was moved by prayer for the land, and the plague was held back from Israel. Now, burnt offerings and peace offerings, these are the two, if we remember Exodus 20, when we have that positive command to build an altar of stone or of earth and offer burnt offerings and peace offerings. None of these offerings that we've mentioned so far in any case have been about sin, and that's really important. My position on sacrifice in general is that we do have one sacrifice once and for all for sin. Like, I don't feel comfortable with anybody trying to make a sin offering today for any reason. To me, if you're offering sacrifices for sin, why do we have a Messiah? You're saying he didn't finish. You're saying his work is incomplete or insufficient. I can't get behind that. And there is a growing move of people, I see this online, there is a growing number of people who are starting to talk about openly offering sin offerings. And they look in those last chapters of Ezekiel with the millennial, it's interpreted to be the millennial temple there, and they'll say, well, see, there's going to be sin offerings in that temple, which is future, so why not now? And I don't have an answer for why there's sin offerings in that particular context. I don't have an answer for that. There's a bunch of theories on why. Yahweh's ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are not ours. So hopefully I get to be in the presence in that temple, and I get to see firsthand why that's going on. But for right now, I just don't have an answer. But I'm not comfortable saying, hey, let's go offer sin offerings. Okay, so just to kind of quash that right now, if anybody has any concerns about James's thoughts on that. So David, a Jew from the tribe of Judah, builds an altar and offers the sacrifices himself with a standing tabernacle, with a functioning Levitical priesthood, and it's okay. So one more scripture in the Old Testament, and then we'll cross over into the Newer Testament. We're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 18. Sorry for the sniffles, guys. This is Elijah, and this is fascinating to me. We're going to read the whole chapter, not because we have to, but because it's awesome. Sometimes you just have to go for it. So 1 Kings chapter 18. Actually, no, we don't have to read the whole thing. We can, because he's talking to Obadiah there. Yeah, let's start in verse 20. So Ahab sent a message to among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. So Elijah is basically throwing down the gauntlet. He's saying, Ahab, we're going to teach you who's boss today. You're going to find out who your true authority is here. So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together to Mount Carmel. Not Jerusalem, not Shiloh, Mount Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If Yahweh is Elohim, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. And I forget who it was. Maybe it was Monty Judah or somebody said that's like the saddest thing in the whole scriptures. Like, was it Brad Scott? Yeah, it really is, because it's like they have no defense for what they're doing. You know, it's like when you get busted and you've done something that you know you was wrong and you get the deer in the headlights look. These people, they know, you know, and they have zero answer. Nothing they can say can justify what they're doing here, and they know it. Verse 22, then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of Yahweh, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now let them give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves, and cut it up, and place it on the wood, and put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will put a fire under it. I will not put a fire under it. So they get to do the sacrifice to the normal means. They're going to do wood and fire and the whole thing like normal. Elijah's going to do that, but without the fire. He's not going to light it. And this is kind of lunacy. Like, what kind of weird does he have Tesla technology? Or, I mean, you know, probably not, but some might say he did. You know, you can find anything on YouTube these days. So verse 24, then you will call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh. And the God who answers by fire, he is God, he is Elohim. And all the people said, that's a good idea. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose 1 ox for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many. And call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it. I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier. They're not lighting it themselves. The whole idea is that their God is going to do it. Then they took the ox which was given to them, and they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning and noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leapt about on the altar which they had made. It came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened. So there, I just have to point this out. When it says in the English, in different translations say different things, but he's gone aside, that's kind of an idiom for maybe he's on the potty. Maybe he went off in the bushes to do, you know, like really laying it in and mocking this. Because, you know, the people at this time, and our Bible does talk about Yahweh in anthropomorphic terms, but the heathen, the pagans that worshipped other gods, actually looked at their gods in human terms. Obviously, they have humanoid idols that they made. They gave them human features. We see this developed on in Greek mythology, where they give their gods human lusts and human passions, and they're just like us. They're just, you know, more powerful. I mean, what's that? Yeah, like the Avengers. Yeah, the Avengers, the X-Men, you know, Batman. Yeah, definitely. Well, Batman has a 9-pack, so we might not. He might be above all this, but that's a joke. If anyone's seen Lego Batman, he doesn't have a 6-pack. He has a 9-pack. Okay, so verse 28. So they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom. Now the Hebrews are told not to cut themselves to worship our gods. We're not supposed to cut our flesh, but this was part of what they did for their rituals. They cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out on them. When midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of Yahweh, which had been torn down. That is fascinating. He's on Mount Carmel. He's not in Jerusalem. He's not in Shiloh. He's nowhere near the tabernacle. And he's repairing the altar of Yahweh that was on Mount Carmel. Somebody had built an altar of Yahweh there, and it had fell into disrepair. And he's going there, he's repairing it, and he calls it the altar of Yahweh, and now he's about to do this big epic thing on it. Elijah took 12 stones, verse 31, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of Yahweh had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. So with the stones he built an altar in the name of Yahweh, And he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, and the altar filled the trench with water. So he's just made it impossible in the flesh, in the physical, to light this fire. You can't light water on fire. It has to have some kind of accelerant in it. And even then, the water itself is not burning. Verse 36, "At the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, 'O Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are Elohim, and that you have turned their heart back again.' Then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, 'Yahweh, he is Elohim. Yahweh, he is Elohim.' Then Elijah said to them, 'Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape.' So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon and slew them there. Now Elijah said to Ahab, 'Go up and eat, drink, for there is the sound of the roar of a heavy shower.'" And so this is just epic. And to me, this is one of the biggest examples of the power of worship. The whole point of Elijah doing this was to show the people Yahweh's authority. They had come out from under his authority and were worshiping Baal and other gods, and they didn't have an answer for that. And so he's using this sacrifice to put it back in their faces who they actually should be serving and who they should have been serving all along. So again, its authority is the reason why the sacrifice is happening here. So now we're going to cross into the New Testament in the book of Acts. We're going to go to Acts 15. Now, there's not a lot mentioned in the New Testament about sacrifice. And this is, some people will jump on that because you have one camp that says if something in the Old Testament is not repeated in the New Testament, it's irrelevant. So like in other words, Jesus never went around saying, "Hey, you guys ought to keep the Sabbath. So therefore we don't have to keep the Sabbath." Not stopping to think he was talking to a bunch of Jews who were already keeping the Sabbath. That's like me going around to Christians today saying, "Hey, you guys need to go to church on Sunday." They already do that. Why would I bother? Okay, so Acts chapter 15, we're going to start reading in verse 22. Acts 15, 22 through 29. And because there's not a lot of detail about it, we're going to read between the lines, and we're going to do some critical thinking, and we're going to apply some logic. To me, when you read the scriptures, what's not said is just as important as what is said. So Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 22. This is the response. So they just had their meeting, and they're deciding what to do with these Gentiles, and they're going to send them this letter explaining what they're doing here. So verse 22, "Then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole assembly to choose men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, Judas called Barsabbas and Silas, leading men among the brethren. And they sent this letter by them. The apostles and the brethren who were elders, to the brethren in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia who are from the Gentiles, greetings. Since we have heard that some of our number to whom we gave no instruction have disturbed you with their words, unsettling your souls, it seemed good to us, having become of one mind, to select men to send to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Master Yahshua the Messiah. Therefore, we have sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will also report the same things by word of mouth. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these essentials, that you abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves free from such things, you will do well. Farewell." Now, this is written after Calvary. This is after the crucifixion, right? So modern theology says that, especially within mainstream Christianity, after Calvary, we don't do sacrifices at all anymore, okay? There's no need. Every single sacrifice, including like the peace offerings, things like that, they're all off the table. But it's interesting here. He tells them to abstain from things offered to idols. Offered to idols. So what is he not telling them? There's no mention here of abstaining from things offered to Yahweh. And I think that's important. He's by making the distinction, don't eat things offered to idols, then that means you can eat things offered to Yahweh. Does that make sense? If I'm just thinking as logically as I can here, I can make that statement. And so, because otherwise he could have just said, don't eat things offered. Don't eat anything that's been sacrificed, period, across the board, because that would cover the gamut of, things going on in the temple there and things going on outside the temple, and everybody's covered. Does that make sense? So to me, that's one of those things where we kind of read between the lines and kind of see what it's not saying to kind of reinforce what it is saying. So Acts chapter 21, we're going to read this, and this one's huge because this is Paul's defense. He's coming back to Jerusalem towards the end of his ministry here, and we're going to read what's going on. And we're not going to read the whole chapter. I think we're going to start in verse, let's see here. We're going to start reading in verse 15, I think. But he's explaining, everybody reads Paul, and not everybody, but, mainstream Christianity reads Paul, and they come to the antinomian conclusion. Paul says not to keep the commandments. And so we're going to read, that was already being thought at that time. People were already saying, hey, Paul's saying not to keep the commandments. And so he's going to defend himself against that accusation here in a very interesting way. So verse 15, after these days we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking us up to Manasseh of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing with whom we were to lodge. After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the following day Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which Elohim had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying Elohim, and they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. So this is decades after Calvary, and you have Jewish people that are believers in the body that are zealous for the Torah. They didn't get the memo, apparently. They didn't read Galatians. If you're zealous for the Torah, you've fallen from grace. They apparently didn't understand that. So verse 21, they have been told about you that you're teaching all the Jews who were among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. So that's the accusation. These Jews are saying, you're going around telling people not to keep the commandments, not to circumcise their kids. Verse 22, what then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. Therefore do this, what we tell you. We have 4 men who were under a vow. Now, this is a Nazirite vow. We can go back in the Old Testament. I forget the address on it. Number 6? Numbers chapter 6? Okay, Numbers chapter 6. So he's referring to that. These guys are going into the temple to complete a Nazirite vow decades after Calvary. And if you go and you read the Nazirite vow, there's animal sacrifice involved in the completion of it. You offer the hair that you just shaved off your body, but you also offer an animal. And this is after Calvary. So now we're getting into, before we were talking about where can you offer sacrifices, and we were looking at all these examples of people offering sacrifices outside of Jerusalem, outside Shiloh, outside the Levitical system. Now we're looking kind of in time. Now we're looking about after Calvary, the idea of people offering sacrifices after that had happened. And of course, location. Location isn't as relevant here because he's clearly going to the temple, so we're not having to figure out, well, he's in the wrong spot. But under modern theology, he's in the wrong time. It's too late to be doing this. You shouldn't be doing sacrifices after Calvary. Let's see, where was I? Verse. Okay, so verse 23. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who were under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law, keeping the Torah. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, he's referring back to Acts 15, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. Again, he's not saying meat sacrificed, period. From blood and from what is strangled, and from fornication. And Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. Now, Paul could have told these guys, now wait a minute, we're after Calvary at this point. We don't do animal sacrifice anymore. I'm not going to go in and help these guys do a ritual involving animal sacrifice to show that I'm advocating keeping the Torah. He could have presented an alternate plan. Let me do X, Y, Z instead. But he went along and did what they said. So was Paul guilty of violating the Messiah? Was he coming out from under the blood of Messiah by going in and offering animal sacrifices after Calvary? I think not. I know there's an anti-Pauline sentiment these days. I'm not one of the anti-Paul types. I think Paul was a righteous man of Yahweh, and I value his words. So the fact that he went in and offered animal sacrifices tells me that in certain circumstances, it's acceptable after Calvary. Okay? So let's go to 1 Corinthians 9. 1 Corinthians comes before 2 Corinthians, for those of you in Rio Linda. Little Rush Limbaugh reference there. 1 Corinthians 9, we're going to read verses 1 through 14. 9, 1 through 14. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Yahshua, our master? Are you not my work in the master? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For if you are the seal of my apostleship in the master. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the master and Cephas and Peter? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the Torah also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. Elohim is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing in the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much that we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nonetheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Messiah. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also Yahweh directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. And so he used a reference here. He's basically talking about, we're giving up our lives. We have no livelihood. Now, he was a tent maker. He made a point, Paul specifically, to have an income so people couldn't accuse him of being a deadbeat. But he's basically saying, we really have no real life here apart from spreading the gospel. We need to eat. So is it fair for us to ask that you guys give us something, some food and water and maybe some lodging in exchange for the spiritual gift that we're giving you guys? And he's talking here in verse 13, do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So he's going back to the Levitical system here. There were offerings that the priests ate. The showbread was an offering, the grain offering. When you offer a grain offering, part of it was burnt up in the fire to Yahweh, and the rest was eaten by the priests. A lot of the animal sacrifices, the oxen, the goats and stuff, were eaten by the priests, and some of them were also eaten by the person offering them. Passover is a good example. Passover is eaten by the person offering it. And so he's using that in his example, and he's not saying past tense. He's speaking present tense, and he's using it as an example. So if we just think logically, if at his time people were not supposed to have anything to do with animal sacrifice, why would he use this as a positive example of him getting some kind of payment for his spiritual services? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go to, we're going to back up to Deuteronomy now. We got to hit some things in Deuteronomy. And we're going to get to Leviticus 17, but we've got to set it up some more first. So we've been talking about location in place. We've been talking about location in time. Now we're going to get more into the authority aspect of it. Deuteronomy 12, we're going to read verses 1 through 18. Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 18. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which Yahweh, the God of your fathers, has given to you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, and on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their asherim with fire, and you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. You shall not act like this toward Yahweh your Elohim. I mentioned earlier back in Exodus 20, he's making a distinction. He's saying, don't worship me with idols of silver and gold. Instead, worship me this way. Okay? He doesn't want us, he's spirit. He's not seen. He doesn't want us to, and we see this in Christianity, especially in Catholicism, where we have to have a visual representation of everything. It's very visual. And in Judaism, to an extent, we have something similar. They don't do what we would call idols, but it is still very iconic in the fact that they use symbols, they use, menorahs. It's still very visual. And I'm not saying that aspect of it is wrong. I'm just saying it's our human instinct to have something we can look at. It's natural to us. But of course, Yahweh wants us to move beyond our flesh, and he wants us to worship him in spirit and truth. So where was I? Verse 5, but you shall seek Yahweh at the place which Yahweh your Elohim will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. There you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, lots of different types. So a tithe is an offering. It's a type of offering. There also you shall put your household, there also you and your household shall eat before Yahweh your Elohim, and rejoice in all your undertakings in which Yahweh your Elohim has blessed you. You shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For you have not yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which Yahweh your Elohim has given you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies around you, so that you live in security, then it shall come about that the place in which Yahweh your Elohim will choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, your contribution of your hand, and all your choice votive offerings, which you shall vow to Yahweh. And you shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim, you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see. And this is important. But in the place which Yahweh chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. So he's talking about here in the context of, when he puts his name somewhere, when he puts his authority. And at this time, he's referring, this is Deuteronomy, it's going to start off in Shiloh, and later on it's going to be Jerusalem. He's saying, I want you to bring all of your offerings to me, okay, in this centralized location is what he's saying here. But we get into verse 15. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates. You may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of Yahweh your Elohim, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You are to pour it out on the ground like water. You are not allowed to eat within your gates the tithe of your grain or new wine or oil, or the firstborn of your herd or flock, or any of your votive offerings which you vow, or your freewill offerings, or the contribution of your hand. But you shall eat them before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which Yahweh your Elohim will choose, you and your son and your daughter, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim in all your undertakings. Now, he's talking about, like I said, you bring offerings to the central place, but he's saying if you're just going to eat meat, you don't have to bring it into the temple. You can eat it anywhere you're at, okay? And this is going to become important as we get into Leviticus 17 here in a minute. Let's go to Deuteronomy 16 next, a couple pages over. We're going to read verses 5 through 7. Deuteronomy 16, 5 through 7. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which Yahweh your Elohim has given you, but at the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to establish his name, you shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset at the time which you came out of Egypt. You shall cook and eat it in the place which Yahweh your Elohim chooses. In the morning you are to return to your tents. Now there's a couple things there. He point blank says you can't just offer sacrifice anywhere. And so this is one of the things that comes up today. If you talk about actually offering a lamb for Passover, well, you can't do that because you're not there in Jerusalem. You're not there where his name is. And so, but it's interesting because we're going to get into a little bit more of that here in a minute. But he's also talking about, where was it here? And this is another thing that comes up. This is kind of a sidebar issue, but it comes up with Passover in general. Can you leave your house at night? We know that in the first Passover in Exodus 12, the answer was no, not unless you want to end up as a carcass. But here he says, you shall cook and eat it in the place which Yahweh your God chooses. This is verse 7. In the morning you are to return to your tents, which implies that overnight you were not in your tents. So to me, I envision, they've all gathered together at Jerusalem or Shiloh or whatever, and they're having a communal kind of thing, and then they all kind of go back home in the morning. So if anybody has any questions about, can I leave my house on Passover night? I think that in modern times, especially in this, I think the answer is yes, you can. Now, we haven't always thought that. We've had instances where, I had to leave my house at night on Passover, and I was afraid of being struck down. I was like, I'm going to step out that door, and that's the end for James, and I didn't die, but now I know I wasn't going to anyway. But this is important because he's talking specifically about the Passover here. So let's go to Leviticus 17. We're going to come back to Deuteronomy. We're going to kind of mingle some verses here to kind of make a point. But now we're going to go to Leviticus 17. Because remember, I made the statement earlier that I think this whole thing has to do with authority. So let's go to Leviticus 17. That's before Deuteronomy, not after. We're going to read the whole chapter. It's kind of short. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons and to all the sons of Israel, and say to them, This is what Yahweh has commanded, saying, Any man from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or who slaughters it outside the camp, and has not brought it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to Yahweh before the tabernacle of Yahweh, blood guiltiness is to be reckoned to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. The reason is so that the sons of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they were sacrificing in the open field, that they may bring them into Yahweh at the doorway of the tent of meeting to the priest, and sacrifice them as sacrifices of peace offerings to Yahweh. The priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of Yahweh at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and offer up the fat in smoke as a soothing aroma to Yahweh. They shall no longer sacrifice their sacrifices to the goat demons, it says in English. Some translations will say various things, with which they play the harlot. This shall be a permanent statute to them throughout their generations. It's interesting there in English where it says goat demons or whatever. In the Hebrew, it's just the word for goat. And this is what's that? Yeah, it's the same word when you read about Esau being hairy like a goat. It's that same exact word, which is interesting. This is one of those things I don't know exactly what this means, what they were doing there. But so verse 8, You shall say to them, Any man from the house of Israel, or from the strangers who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to offer it to Yahweh, that man also shall be cut off from his people. And if any man from the house of Israel or from the strangers who sojourn among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of life that makes atonement. Therefore I said to the sons of Israel, No person among you may eat blood, nor may any stranger who sojourns among you eat blood. So when any man from the sons of Israel or from the strangers who sojourn among them in hunting catches a beast or a bird which may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For as the life is in the flesh, its blood is identified with its life. Therefore I said to the sons of Israel, You are not to eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. When any person eats an animal which dies or is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or stranger, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and remain unclean until evening, then he becomes clean. But if he does not wash them or bathe his body, then he shall bear his guilt. So the important thing is here is Yahweh is basically saying, I don't want you guys out there away from the camp, out there in the outskirts or wherever you're at. I don't want you guys killing animals and offering sacrifices out there. I want you to bring them all into me, to the central place where I'll put my name. And he says specifically, It's because they were playing the harlot and offering them to goat demons, whatever this means, okay, however you interpret that. Obviously, if you're sacrificing something to a goat demon, you're not sacrificing it to Yahweh. So we get back into that whole authority thing. What is the purpose of your sacrifice? So let's go to Deuteronomy. We're going to go back to Deuteronomy 12. And we're going to focus in on some scriptures that we already read, but we're going to read them again just to kind of reinforce. Deuteronomy 12, we're going to focus in on verses 13 through 15. And with Leviticus 17, it's important to note, when he starts in with this whole thing, it's after, we get into chapter 16, this whole section of dialogue is happening after Nadab and Abihu have died. So they brought in the strange fire to the temple, Yahweh struck them dead. He's telling the Israelites this thing about not sacrificing out in the open field, out of town, after Nadab and Abihu. So just as a chronological interest, if the plan was to always exclusively have it done in Jerusalem or Shiloh or wherever, why is he only seemingly just now saying it in Leviticus 17? Because we read some stuff, and we're going to read again here. Let's just go ahead and read it. Deuteronomy 12, 13 through 15. I got to get there first. Deuteronomy 12, 13 through 15. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, but in the place which Yahweh chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of Yahweh your Elohim, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. So, and then he talks about not eating the blood. So if we go back to Leviticus 17, he's saying, basically, I don't want you to do this in the open field because of how you're doing it. You're not offering it to me. He just said here that if you're just going to kill an animal to eat it, you can do it wherever you're at. Okay? So this is kind of in modern terms, if we're just going to say that, because we know that back then, they didn't just have a grocery store where they could just go and get ribeyes or whatever. If you actually had to kill an animal, it was a sacrifice, even if your only intent was to eat it. Because if you kill a sheep, there goes a source of wool that you could have made money on, that you could have clothed your family with. If you kill an ox, that ox could have been used to plow a field. So just to eat the animal itself is a hardship. It is a sacrifice. But it's not necessarily a ritualistic type sacrifice. So he's basically saying, I think, in Leviticus 17, you guys have kind of, because they went from a place where they were able to sacrifice and eat animals outside of the centralized location, and then Yahweh took it back and said, I don't want you guys doing that anymore. And I think it's because they were straying, they were moving away from his authority. They were abusing that privilege, and so he kind of reined it in. Does that make sense? It's like it's like if we have kids that we trust them to do certain things, and then they prove to us that they just can't do those certain things. We have to rein it in a little bit, and kind of bring it back in and see if they can handle that. And if they still can't handle that, then we bring in a little bit more. And we kind of see that pattern with Yahweh all throughout the Torah and the prophets. We're showing that we just can't handle these basic things he wants us to do. So he just kind of brings it back a little bit. He adds a little bit more control in to kind of give us more to work with and kind of give us more boundaries. And ultimately, I think, when his word is written on our hearts, we won't need those anymore because we'll just intrinsically behave the way we should. But for the time being, we constantly demonstrate that we're just going to blow right on past whatever boundaries he sets for us. That's just human nature. So Deuteronomy 16:16, let's go there real quick. This will be our last scripture. And this is an overall point I want to make about location. Deuteronomy 16:16. Helps if I'm in the right chapter. 3 times in a year all your males shall appear before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, and at the feast of weeks, and the feast of booths. They shall not appear before Yahweh empty-handed. So I brought this in just as a point of logic, because we're talking about the idea that if a person wants to make a sacrifice of any type, okay, we see the language talking about having to do that at the place where he chooses. But we also see language that talks about people, and we've seen numerous examples of people not doing it in those locations. People like Elijah, people like David, Samuel, etc. And so, instead of having a binary mindset, like here in Western culture, everything has to be one or the other, you can't have any nuance in the middle. People will say, well, you can't do any sacrifices at all, or people will say, well, you can sacrifice anywhere, just do whatever you want. But the truth is in the middle. There's certain cases where we can and certain places where we can't. And I think it has to do with his authority. But when we look at these 3 feasts here, we have a clear commandment that all those men are supposed to go wherever Yahweh places his name, wherever he chooses. And so that was Shiloh, that was Jerusalem. There's no other place in Scripture where it says Yahweh put his name or he put his authority. Now, I plan on keeping the feast this year. I plan on doing Passover. I plan on doing unleavened bread. I plan on doing Pentecost, Shavuot. I plan on doing Sukkot. I obviously can't go to Jerusalem. So if we're going to make the argument that a person can't make a sacrifice because they can't do it in the place where Yahweh put his name or his authority, then by that logic, I can't do any of these feasts either because I can't go to the place where he put his name. Does that make sense? So if we're going to be consistent with our application, then if I'm saying I can do these things, then what am I really saying? I'm saying where I'm doing these things, Yahweh is causing his name to dwell. We just read in Exodus 20 that he will bless us, wherever his name is remembered, wherever he causes his name to be remembered. Like in my house personally, his name is remembered. His name is revered. His authority, his reputation is honored, and we've submitted to it. We get into the New Testament and we see Paul, we see other examples of this idea that, the Father is the head, Messiah comes under him, the husband comes under him, the wife and the children. It's a chain of authority. And in my opinion, and I said this in the Passover teaching, if a household has submitted themselves to Yahweh's authority properly through that chain, then his name dwells there. And if we base it on that, then in modern times, in my opinion, if a person chooses to offer sacrifices, excluding the sin offering, I want to be clear about that, but if a person chooses to keep Passover, offer a free will offering, any of the other acceptable offerings, if their household is truly submitted to the authority of Yahweh, and that has to be key, if there's any doubt in a person's mind, is my household truly under the authority of Yahweh? Don't even get started, because Nadab and Abihu played that game and it didn't work for them. So, but if you are truly convicted that you are under his authority, your household, I personally see no problem with a person doing a sacrifice, especially like Passover, because Passover, out of all the sacrifices, has the most spiritual significance. And you could say Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, but none of us can do Yom Kippur. That one is very specific. There's no doubt who can do that one. It has to be Aaron or a son of Aaron, one day a year in a specific place. There are no exceptions. That one's off the table. But for any of the other sacrifices, grain offering, peace offering, Thanksgiving offering, Passover, just based on the compendium of evidence here, I personally see no reason why a person couldn't do that if they had the right motives, the right intentions, and they were under the proper authority structure. So that's it. So sacrifice, where and when. We didn't get into like the spiritual stuff about the sacrifices, because that's a whole big thing, because each specific sacrifice has different spiritual things that it teaches us and points to. Some are more weighty than others. But sacrifice in general, I do think is something that a person could do today. I personally don't see anything wrong with it apart from sin offering. I would never do a sin offering. But I'm going to close it with that. If anybody has any questions, comments, or strong opinions, we'll go ahead and take them now.